Hey, what's up? This is Sam from Dream River Designs, and I am back with another build video. Today I'm going to show you how I built this massive elm conference table in my tiny basement shop. So stick around and watch how I really screwed this thing up. So a year ago, the client contacted me. They found my website and they said they wanted a conference table. Now this was a dream come true. This was the exact type of build that I was looking for. It was my one chance, and I told myself I was not going to make any big mistakes. Well, it turns out I think I made major errors every single step of the process. That said, I'm lucky that my brother has a tractor and we were able to receive it at his house. You can't move it by yourself, and we couldn't even move it with two of us until we cut it in half. Even then, it was just a beast. It's 3 inches thick, it's still wet, it's just incredibly heavy and hard on your back. But we managed to get it on the trailer and we brought it to my house. We're setting it there on my surfacing table, and that table is far too small to surface these slabs, and so I had to rebuild the whole thing. I got rid of the EMT conduit and I replaced everything with SBR rails, I think they're called. After I surface it, I can remove the bark. I chose to do this after surfacing because it's less bark to remove. However, a dull chisel is not the way to do this. This took me forever. You should use a draw knife or a spoke shape or whatever. Don't use a dull chisel. So at the end of the table, you can see that the slabs are wider than my final dimension, and I wanted to use as much wood as possible, use as little epoxy as I could, and so I have to cut this big chunk off one side. I kind of made it up as I went along. I wasn't sure exactly how I was going to join the two, but I knew that I wanted it to be seamless. So I started by cutting off the bulk of the wood with the track saw, and then I went at it with the belt sander. You can see it makes a decent join, but I wasn't quite happy with it. I knew that when I was going to surface it lower, that it would no longer match up. So I cut off another chunk of wood, and I chose to go at it with the jigsaw. I did that cut over and over and brought them closer and closer together, and it did work. You saw there it matched up pretty well. However, I ended up surfacing below my join at the end of the day, so I didn't quite get the seam that I wanted. This math is super complicated. I'm not going to get into the weeds of all of it. There's strange equations and other things that are hard to explain, and just know that it's very involved, and I managed to screw it up. After surfacing, I brought them to the kiln, which you saw there. They sat in the kiln for a month and they dried beautifully. They were down to like 5%. Problem was, one of them twisted, this one here. And so I saw a YouTube video where this guy, he preserved thickness by routing out these relief grooves in the bottom of the slab. And then he clamped it flat and pounded a bunch of wedges into the grooves. And he ended up with a really good product, a thick slab table. And so I thought I could do it too. It worked okay, I guess. I didn't go quite deep enough because I was paranoid that I was going to break through the other side. But I also filled them with epoxy, and so I feel like it ended up pretty stable, and I was able to preserve thickness. Now there's lots of ways to achieve a perfect rectangle with a router. I decided to do it the worst way that I could think of. I probably spent 5 hours with these chisels getting them perfect. And it's not even the top of the table. It was stupid. I feel like I will think and think and think about an issue like this. Like, how do I put this rectangle in there? And I'll just get set on something like I'm gonna rough it out and then finish up with the chisels. And then I can't think of anything else, and so this is what I'm stuck with. And of course, while I'm doing it, I'm like, this is miserable. I need to learn how to woodwork and all that. So I was able to do it at least. So now I just clamp it down flat and pound wedges into all the grooves. I wanted to get a nice shot of my glue blob. You can see that here. Another mistake here, my grooves were too tight, and so my wedges didn't quite go in deeply enough. However, I think I made up for it by filling all these grooves with epoxy. The last thing to do here is get everything flush so the slab fits flat in the mold. My hand planer is not set up. I failed miserably with that and eventually hit it with the belt sander. Here you can see that we are building the form to pour our epoxy. Use caulk in all of the joints to prevent any leaks, of which there were plenty. We'll get to that later. So this is mold release on the mold. It prevents your epoxy from adhering to the melamine below. I've never forgotten the mold release, but I did have a table that was difficult to pull up from the melamine, and I can only imagine how miserable it would be if you do forget the mold release, so I always cross it off. Before you do your deep pour, you need to seal your slabs. This prevents air, bubbles from escaping your slabs into the epoxy. It also prevents liquid dye from escaping your epoxy and staining your slab. So I just paint epoxy over the whole thing, let it dry, and then do my deep pour. You can also see some dowel holes there in the end of the slab. We had originally thought to connect them with dowels, actual wood dowels, and abandoned that idea when it became too difficult to line them up. However, I think that they filled with epoxy, and so they provided some stabilization that way too. Now, the big mistake here was we made the form slightly too small. and so I had to kind of really reef on the slabs to get them to fit in the epoxy, and I didn't know it at the time, but I found out later that I broke the caulk seal and I ruined the mold, and you'll see why that was a problem when I pour. And I wish I had got it on film. Another thing that happened when I was mixing here, I had a major spill. I pulled too hard on my drill trigger and it splashed probably a gallon of epoxy everywhere, all over my legs. My shoes were saturated. It got all over the floor. It was miserable, and I was already stressed out because I'm pouring epoxy. So don't do that. My ratio was 6 milliliters of dye to 3 gallons of epoxy. It's important to know this number in case you need to pour again. You want the exact same ratio so the colors are exactly the same. And like I mentioned before, I screwed up my math, and so I definitely did have to pour again. And here's the pour. Right away, it started leaking bad in like 5 places. And I had Flex Seal, but I didn't have a lot, and it wasn't doing anything. As soon as I'd put Flex Seal on, it would just bubble up somewhere else and start leaking. And so I almost panicked, but I stayed calm, and I realized that if I used a thin sliver of wood, put some Flex Seal down, and then push the sliver of wood on there, it would distribute the pressure better and it'd stop the leak. So I only lost, I don't know, maybe 50 mils of epoxy, but I was able to stop it before I went to bed, thank God. So you can see I'm a little bit short on epoxy. I just rough everything up for a mechanical bond, clean it, and then pour one more time. Now once this thing cured, we had to lean it up against the wall so I could build the surfacing table to surface it, and it was just massive. It was unwieldy, and it had sharp edges, very hazardous, but we managed it without getting hurt. So now I built the surfacing table and I'm anchoring the slab down. Probably don't even need to, it's so heavy, but might as well. Then I surfaced for 19 hours. It was the most miserable 19 hours of my life. I just had to keep going and going and going. It took forever. I think I blew up 2 routers and I ruined my back. Do not recommend. It was so bad. Plastic dust everywhere. It was just a bad time. Next time I will outsource this. The problem was it was so big that I just couldn't think without like 5 guys how to get this thing out of my basement and get it to somebody's surfacing table. So I did it myself. And that's what happened. So Christmas came early and we got to do some snow shoveling. Again, miserable. Do not recommend. You need to have dust collection when you're doing this. Few of my grooves were short on epoxy. Epoxy kind of shrinks, and when you Google it, Google says that it's negligible, but every time I've had epoxy shrink, it's not negligible, and so I filled these grooves with some more tabletop epoxy. After that, just let it cure, and I can start sanding. I use the Rotex on the geared setting, and I take away all the router marks. and then just go up through all the grits. There's also a lot of touch-ups where I'm filling in pits and voids with CA glue, and then you sand that down again too. I opted for a 21-degree chamfer on the bottom of the edge for the edge profile. I learned this from Cam from Blacktail Studio. I think it looks super cool. It looks professional, like a conference table should, and it just adds a bit of visual interest to the table. And then a quick 1/8" round over on top. You can see those sweatshirt strings are dangling perilously close to my rotary tool. Don't do that. When I was routing my grooves, the boards were bigger, and so I got a little bit too close to the edge, and so there was some black epoxy squares that I had to route out again, and I made patches for them using the belt sander. Once the glue dried, I used the flush trim saw to cut them flush. One more little sliver, and I can sand them flat. There are better ways of doing this. I chose the worst way I could think of. And then put threaded inserts to hold your C-channel in. If you use screws, it damages the table and you can't take them in and out as many times as you want, but with the threaded inserts you can take them in and out all the time. And there were a few large cracks that I wanted to arrest, and so I used bow ties on the bottom here. This was my first time using bow ties. I screwed it up. There's gaps and stuff. Luckily, the reason I chose to do it on the bottom and not the top is because I knew that I wouldn't get it perfect. But it could be worse, and I fill gaps with sawdust. That's kind of my thing. Once again, my hand planer is not set up. It does a terrible job, and my technique is no good either. And so on the top and bottom there, you can see some gaps. All in all, sawdust does a fine job, and it's on the bottom, so who cares? This is sanding down the river portion. I chose to sand the wood and the epoxy at separate times. Sanding epoxy is really difficult, and it is much harder than wood, and so you should treat it differently than wood. And my mistakes continue. This is not how you apply Osmo oil. You should use much less oil. Not only did my technique waste oil, but if you pour oil right on the wood like that, it's gonna stain deeper in places where there's a lot of oil, and it can be difficult to get those marks out. Initially, I also left too much oil on, and so I was buffing forever, and I was still seeing marks in my epoxy. So I fixed that on the, 10th refinish. I refinished this so many times, and it ended up being not because I had too much oil, but my sanding on the epoxy, you can see here, it left all these marks. I sanded up to 600 grit and I simply could not get rid of these marks. And it was infuriating because I wasn't able to see them until I put oil on. I would sand and then I would clean with mineral spirits and it would look great. And then I would apply my oil and I would just see marks everywhere. And so I just sanded it over and over and over again until somebody online told me, use a 3M maroon pad, put it on your sander, and do the final sanding pass with that. And that was finally the thing that worked. I can't believe how many times I refinished this. It was the worst. I'm using one of those cool crisscross X bases. I found it online. I was really pleased with it. It was super solid and the table doesn't wobble or anything. It was a good product. Luckily, I have record of every mistake that I made on this build, and so next time I will do it flawlessly, I promise. If you like this video and want to see more like it, please like and subscribe. And click here for a video similar to this one. This is Sam from Dream River Designs, and here is the final table.